Well, so why would he kill Alexei Navalny? Why would he send Vladimir Kara-Murza to 25 years in prison? Why would he round up any random demonstrator or blogger or anybody who even says the tiniest word of criticism and put them in jail for 8 years? Putin is on the ropes. There's no question. He used to rule with incentives. He would tell everybody, things will get better for you if you keep your head out of politics. And for a while in the economy, things were getting better. They're not anymore. Things are getting worse. The economy is not in good shape in Russia, despite all these statements from Russia that sanctions aren't working. People are suffering in Russia. It's not a good situation. People are dying in the war. And the fact that Putin is taking such harsh and extreme measures against anyone who even mutters a tiny bit of opposition tells you that he's scared. He's scared of his own people. And what Putin is most scared of, specifically, he's scared of any type of public mass uprising. So from his perspective, he can kill individuals. He could kill Alexei Navalny. He could kill many other individuals. He can kill Yevgeny Prigozhin. But what he can't do is he can't quell a popular uprising. So if, for say, 1,000 people show up on Red Square, and then let's say they try to kill whoever sort of was leading that thing, and instead of having everyone disperse, 10,000 people go to Red Square, he can't do anything. And if that happens, then maybe 50,000 go to Red Square, and then 1,000,000 go to Red Square, and at that point, he then will lose power. And that's what he's most afraid of. And that's why there's this absolute, complete totalitarian clampdown on opposition. You can't say a word. You can't say it publicly. There's no media that can say anything because he's scared.
Ukraine has described the inauguration ceremony as seeking to create the illusion of legality for Putin as president. However, Washington has stopped short of refusing to recognize him as the country's leader. Do you agree with that US position?
I think that every foreign government should not recognize Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia. He was not elected legitimately. He's broken every rule to become the president. It wasn't a free and fair election. We should not recognize him as president, and we should show him the disrespect that he deserves.
Russia's Victory Day marks the 79th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. What are your takeaways from this year's parade and speech?
Well, I mean, it's a true irony that Russia was at that time fighting fascism, was fighting genocide, etc., on the side of the Allies, and now Russia is the generator of fascism and genocide, and becoming a true power of evil and in an axis of evil with Iran and North Korea and China. And it really is remarkable that where Russia has come and where it's gone in this whole terrible progress.
According to an assessment by the Washington Post, Putin is setting the Russian Federation up as a bitter adversary to the West for decades to come, and he's recalibrating his country for that purpose. And you mentioned about the potential for uprisings, snowballing. Does he need to take the people with him, Vladimir Putin, or how long can he rule his country with a cast iron fist in the way he's doing at the moment?
Well, there's two possible outcomes. So the first outcome is that it doesn't work. That people have had enough. They can't take it anymore, and they rise up, as we discussed. That has happened. It's happened in a number of places. That's happened. It happened in Ukraine with the Russian puppet Yanukovych. It happened in Tunisia. It happened in Egypt. And those are very clear examples of where people said this is an illegitimate government and we won't have it. But then you have the alternative scenario, which is Kim Jong-un in North Korea, who has been ruling, will continue to rule, and even before him, his father and his grandfather. And so you have the Iranians that somehow keep it all together. And so it's almost impossible to predict where these dictatorships go. But what you can say is that they can turn very quickly, or they can carry on for decades. And that's the problem for Putin himself. He doesn't know how it's all going to work out. He's scared. And that's, of course, the problem for every citizen in Russia who's sitting there living a much worse life, having no freedoms because of this terrible dictator who's running their country.
And you have just returned from the US, where you were discussing something which has been personal to you and a fight for you, the seizure of Russian assets, which you've long called for. We know the US has passed a bill allowing the use of 5 billion of frozen Russian assets for Ukraine. How close now is the US to sending this money?
Well, so the most important thing is, so just to back up for a second, in total, there's 300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that were frozen after the war started. Nobody knew what they were going to do with these reserves, and the intention was to just hold on to them until the war ended, which everybody thought was going to happen very quickly. Of course, it hasn't. We're now more than 2 years into this war, an enormous amount of damage done to Ukraine, much more than the 300 billion that's been frozen, many hundreds of thousands of people, innocent people killed. And so the obvious morally correct thing to do is to take that money and give it to Ukraine for their defense and reconstruction. The original idea was poo-pooed when I first started talking about it. Everyone thought that wasn't going to happen. And of course, now that we're 2 years into it and digging deeper into our own pockets, that's now become a really sort of accepted idea generally among the voters in most countries. Now, in order for it to happen, and as you mentioned, the U.S. passed a law to say that this should be done. It can't happen by the U.S. by themselves. It has to be done in unison, in conjunction with all of the allies. And that means that the UK has to do it, the EU has to do it, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, Japan. We all have to do it together because we're all the countries with reserve currencies. And if one country does it and no other country does it, then it creates risks for the currency of that country. If all countries do it together, then there's really no option but for people to hold reserve currencies. The U.S. will absolutely confiscate this money, and I believe that the U.K. is now warmed up to it as well. If you listen to UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron, he's now speaking openly about confiscating the money as well. The bottleneck at this point is the European Union. Most of the money, 220 billion of the 300 billion, sits in Euroclear in Belgium. This is a place where sort of a custodian account in Belgium. And in order for this money to be confiscated, there needs to be an EU decision. The EU consists of 27 countries that have to agree with each other unanimously to do it. So far, there are voices of dissent within the EU. And so the only thing that they can agree on up until today is that the interest on the money can be confiscated. And they've come up with that decision, which is a good one.
Okay, so to be clear then, the 5 billion stays where it is until the whole 300 billion is agreed.
No, the 5 billion stays where it is until all countries agree to confiscate money in some way, shape, or form. And I think at that point, the money becomes available.
In which case, perhaps no time soon that money will be available, that 5 billion for Ukraine.
Well, it's interesting because just today, the announcement was that all the EU countries have agreed to confiscate the interest. And I think that's going to happen pretty quickly. And that's another 5 billion. So I think it reminds me a lot of the conversations about providing arms to Ukraine. At first, nobody wanted to provide any arms to Ukraine. Yes. And then eventually, like, someone stepped out and said, we'll do some missiles, some long-range missiles. The UK did that. And then all of a sudden, the US said, okay, we'll do our missiles, and so on and so forth. That's how this thing is going to work. And it will, eventually, the money will be confiscated because this war is going to go on. It's going to become too expensive for the taxpayer to fund by themselves. And Russia has 300 billion sitting right there that we should be taking. It makes such logical financial sense as well as moral sense.
It's quite interesting because I was thinking about how you'd react to that news that the EU had agreed to seize the profits from those frozen assets. They're worth around 3 billion euros a year. And I know that was never good enough for you. And we've talked about this before because you wanted the 300 billion and to be completely seized. And I thought, yes, it's a bit like the weapons. And I'm not sure how are you feeling optimistic? Are you frustrated? Are you thinking, well, we're getting there, but slowly?
Well, I've seen it all before. I mean, I've spent almost my entire life in the last 15 years working on getting countries to impose what Magnitsky sanctions, named after my murdered lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes assets and bans visas. And over this time, one country does something that started with the U.S. and then Canada did something, and then the UK. The UK passed the law, but they didn't implement it, and then it took a while for the EU after that, and then we got Australia, and so it's always time consuming. It never works the way you want it to, but I'd be highly confident, no matter what anyone says right now, that 300 billion is going to go to Ukraine. It's just a question of time.
And if and when it does, what kind of effect is that going to have on President Putin and the Russian Federation? How damaging could that be for him and the Kremlin?
I think it would be devastating for him. At the end of the day, war is all about resources. Who has the resources to fight, and what kind of weapons can you buy with those resources? And Putin always had the upper hand in that because Russia's a rich country. It's an oil country. They continue to sell their oil in spite of the sanctions. And Ukraine is a poor country. They don't have any significant natural resources. And all the money was coming from the West, and Putin knew that we were all grumbling, and there was problems at the EU, and there's problems in Congress, and so on. If this money gets freed up, it's a game changer. And you can see, and by the way, Putin values money more than human life, and you can see Putin starting to do nuclear exercises as a way to try to dissuade us from doing this, and probably some people are even dissuaded. This is so important to Putin. He's ready to threaten nuclear war. Now, of course, he's not going to start a nuclear war if we confiscate this money. He's just huffing and puffing, but his reaction shows you how serious and how meaningful this is. I would say next to supplying arms, specifically supplying arms to Ukraine, this is the single next most important thing we could do to help them overcome Putin and win the war.
And should that happen, the Kremlin is promising a harsh response. Does it have any power, significant power, though, to retaliate and seize Western assets?
Well, there's not that many Western assets left, and what's left, everyone's marked down to zero, and what's left, people shouldn't have any. There shouldn't be any argument about that. Anyone who invested in Russia did so at their own risk. There's no reason why the rest of the world should pay the price because some big Western company is going to lose money. This is now for the security, all of our security, our safety. So that the UK and the US and the EU don't have to send our own soldiers in later on to fight Russia.
There are so many ways in which Russia is reported to be circumventing sanctions, be it using countries in Central Asia as halfway houses for exports, neighbouring countries for luxury car imports, EU ports to pass on exports of liquefied natural gas, and partner countries like India, Iran and China to refine and sell on its oil. Can you make sanctions work?
Absolutely, you can make sanctions work. What you need to understand is that this is all new for most governments. Most governments had never wanted to sanction Russia in any way, shape, or form. And so, and I could see this because I spent years trying to get sanctions imposed. Now, all of a sudden, the war started. Everyone is like, "Oh my God, Putin really is a bad guy. We need to do something to stop him." And everybody is just sort of coming up with their skills to do it. I mean, you had to staff these departments with people who'd never done sanctions before. Now they're starting to figure it out. And as you mentioned, all of those things, all those things you just mentioned are no mystery to the governments, the Western governments of the world. I speak to them all the time, and they're literally drinking from a fire hose, trying to come up with ideas on how to close the loopholes. And the thing about it is that people will do these create these sanctions evasion loopholes until the risk of doing so becomes greater than the benefit. And so how do you do that? You create risks. You start to go after the intermediaries. You start to sanction the people who are helping the Russians defy sanctions. And if you do it properly, and I believe that we can, it's going to take time, all of a sudden, all these loopholes will disappear. It's just a question of time.
And will.
There's the will. I mean, as long as Putin continues to do what he's doing, there's absolutely the will to do it. The one place where there isn't the will is, and this is the biggest, the elephant in the room, is that Russia continues to sell oil, and the oil is not sanctioned. They've created something called the price cap, which is a nonsense. And Russia makes between 500 million and $1 billion a day selling oil, and they use that money to buy weapons to kill Ukrainians, and then we're sending billions over to the Ukrainians to fight back on the Russians. And we can't, or we don't want to mess with the oil, for a logical reason, which is that Russia makes up 10% of the world's oil supply. And if we curtail that oil supply, then the oil price goes to $250 a barrel. Inflation spikes back up, and then we have all sorts of other problems. And so at the moment, we're not touching the oil. My idea is that we have allies, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, other countries that are oil producers. We should lean on them. And the United States, by the way, is the biggest oil producer in the world. The United States should export more oil, should pump more oil and export more oil. And then we should cut off Russia when we have enough supply in the system so it doesn't matter. And by the way, if we were to properly embargo Russian oil, the war would be over in 9 months because they'd run out of money.
So what's next for you, Bill?
Well, the most important thing right now is my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza. I'm trying to do everything I possibly can to come up with a scenario, probably a prisoner swap, so that Vladimir doesn't die imminently in a Russian prison.
And are you getting close to that?
Well, it helps when the Pulitzer Committee awards him a Pulitzer Prize. The key now is to make sure that everybody in Western governments understand first how important he is as a leader of the opposition, and second how vulnerable he is as someone who's going to die imminently if we don't do something.
Just going back to this issue of Putin's personal position, it was interesting you wrote recently for the Times, Mark, about reports that the Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov is terminally ill. Just remind us, first of all, why Kadyrov is so important and why that would have significant implications for Putin.
In many ways, one of the events that really made Putin and his reputation in Russia was the Second Chechen War, which started when he was actually prime minister before he was president, but then was in a way the first real challenge of his presidency. And look, the Russians won, but the way they won, apart from being monstrously brutal, we saw the capital of Grozny pretty much leveled, was essentially by Chechenizing the conflict, finding their own Chechens to fight the rebel Chechens. And as a result, out from that came a sort of dynastic rule. First of all, it was actually Kadyrov's father, Akhmat Kadyrov, who became the first leader of sort of a loyalist Chechnya. And then in due course, Ramzan Kadyrov, the current one, replaced him. And what's really happened is that in the name of subduing Chechnya, basically Chechnya was bought off on a massive scale. I mean, Kadyrov basically runs Chechnya as his own private personal fiefdom with extraordinary brutality and extraordinary levels of corruption. Over 80% of the Chechen budget comes from Moscow. It's provided by the federal government. And every time someone says, oh, isn't it time perhaps to cut down on this money? So basically Kadyrov throws his toys out of the pram and Moscow backs down because, frankly, I think Putin and his cohorts have convinced themselves that Kadyrov is the man who's keeping the lid on Chechnya, who's actually, through a mix of brutality and local politics, is able to actually keep the Chechens under control. And what they're terrified of, especially at the moment, is of Chechnya once again boiling over. Because, Chechnya, it's a small region, but it has periodically rebelled against control by the Russians. Every time it gets a chance, essentially. And the Chechens, frankly, are hard as nails. So, I mean, for all these reasons, there is that sense of, look, let's just not rock the boat. We know that basically what's happening in Chechnya is ghastly. You've more or less got Sharia law in contravention of the Russian constitution. And Moscow's having to pay for it, as well as a lot of vanity projects. But look, it's just a lot easier to keep the status quo going. But now, if it's true that Kadyrov is mortally ill, and certainly he was at the inauguration, and looking at this footage that he needed two guys to help him take his jacket off, he was definitely not looking in good shape. If it's true, then in some ways Putin's hand is going to be pushed at the very moment when he least needs this to happen. Because if there is any sort of kickoff in Chechnya, the question is who would deal with it when his army is, I think it's 97% of all operational ground forces are currently deployed to Ukraine. The last thing he wants is a third Chechen war.
Is there any obvious successor to Kadyrov in Chechnya?
Well, Kadyrov clearly wanted to keep this in the family, and he was grooming his sons to take over, but his oldest son is only 18, has no real credible standing, and in any case, the law says you have to be 30 to be Chechen leader. Now, again, maybe they could tweak that a bit, but probably not 12 years. And although in the past, sort of when Ramzan Kadyrov wasn't quite old enough to take over when his father died, they put in a sort of temporary regent in effect. But a 12-year temporary regency isn't possible. So there are various candidates. The man who Moscow seems to favor is Apti Alaudinov, who is currently the head of commanding Chechen forces inside Ukraine, and to be honest, is a bit more urbane, even to the point of actually he speaks good Russian in a way that Ramzan Kadyrov almost spoke comically bad, accented Russian. Sounded a little bit like something out of Allo Allo. So they would clearly like Alaudinov to take over. But the problem is there's a whole variety of other Chechen bigwigs who also may well feel that they have equally, if not better, status and standing. And the big concern is if they try and impose Alaudinov, are others going to start kicking off and saying, no, we're not accepting that? And, in Chechnya, there is a whole variety of security forces that are notionally Russian-controlled. In practice, they are Kadyrov-controlled. And if you take Kadyrov away, these people swear a personal oath to Kadyrov. So if you take him out of the picture, then the risk is that a whole bunch of different warlords will have their own ready-made armies.
And what might be the trigger for some kind of internal move against Putin? You say if things get worse, what would need to happen?
I think we've got to realize that this is an elite that is not really full of Putinists. Sure, they will troop along to the inauguration and stand there and applaud as Putin gives his rather perfunctory speech there and so forth. But on the whole, essentially, this is an elite that is full of ruthless, opportunistic kleptocrats. They supported Putin, and they support Putin so long as it is in their interest to do so, and so long as the risks in not doing so are sort of clear and visible. So essentially, there's a constant cost-benefit analysis. Now, at the moment, there's no question, but that the risks of going against Putin massively outweigh the potential opportunities. But things may well change. And I think particularly if we start to see, for example, the economy overheating, as may well happen as the war goes on, as we begin to see actually ordinary people feeling more and more the pressure of that, we're likely to see more economic unrest. And that's what's particularly dangerous to the regime. And if that starts to really take off, it's one thing if it's the strike here and the strike there that can be controlled. The big nightmare, I think, is something like the Solidarity Trade Union in Poland back in end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, where almost out of nothing, one strike in a shipyard suddenly became a national movement because there were so many people who were so fed up, and a leadership that basically emerged from nowhere. I think that's the big nightmare, something like that takes all the protest potential that at the moment has nowhere to go in Russia and brings it all together. And that's when we might see the elite beginning to think, well, basically, either we break with Putin now, or we risk finding ourselves hanging from a lamppost in a week or a month or a year's time. But as I said, I think they will need that sense that there is a real threat to themselves. So I think for the moment, everything looks very calm and everyone is saying all the right things. But there is that constant, question, assessing today. Is today the day? Of course not. But tomorrow might be, whatever.
And of course, so much of that may depend on what happens in Ukraine. Let's turn to the war directly. Are you expecting, Mark, Russia to launch a fresh ground offensive in the coming weeks?
Well, in a way, Russia has never stopped launching ground offensives. I mean, this is it. What we have seen is a constant incremental push forward. 100 meters here, maybe a kilometer there, but bit by bit they are moving forward, taking advantage of the fact that at the moment they have an advantage in both manpower and ammunition. Though obviously now that we've had the American bill pass through, then at least the ammunition will start to become more evident. I'm not convinced that they have at the moment the resources for some kind of major escalation in their ground offensive. So yes, we're seeing them trying to take Chasiv Yar at the moment. There's talk maybe of a move against Kharkiv in the north in the future. And these are significant. But I think unless Putin bites the bullet and launches another mobilization wave, which if this is going to be meaningful, he has to do pretty damn soon. Because it takes time between announcing it, mustering your forces, giving them some basic training, arming them, getting to the battlefield. And if you're really trying to take advantage of the summer, you've really got to do this in June, July. So unless we see that, I think we will see offensives. We will see the Russians probably pushing forward, but nothing that is going to be absolutely war winning. It's going to be simply part of this slow accretional conflict.
Are you surprised that Putin hasn't launched a fresh wave of mobilization yet? I mean, a lot of people thought maybe he was waiting for the election to pass. Maybe he's waiting for his inauguration. That has now happened. So are you surprised it's taken this long?
Not really, because this is classic Putin. For all his kind of macho persona, Putin actually tries to avoid taking tough decisions. And when he does, usually he takes them quite late, often too late. We saw that actually with the last mobilization wave. Again, he had been being hassled by his generals for months. And when he eventually did it, really, it was just in time for autumn, winter, which is not really campaigning season. So, it could still happen. It may well be, in some ways, you're right. There was the elections, the inauguration. There is one more milestone, which is the announcement of the new government. Because the current cabinet formally resigns and he appoints a new one, which will probably be much the same as the old one. But there is some thought, in the light of the recent arrest of Deputy Defense Minister on corruption charges, that maybe Defense Minister Shoigu may be being replaced. And so it may well be that they'll think they'll bring in a new defense minister and use the kind of the momentum of that announcement to also announce a mobilization. So it could still happen. But as I said, it will be classic Putin if he only ends up biting the bullet and doing this in August, September, when he's missed his key window of opportunity.
If he does replace Shoigu as defense minister, what would be the significance of that? Because, of course, there was a lot of beef, I suppose you could say, between Prigozhin and Shoigu. Maybe Putin felt he couldn't move Shoigu too soon because it would appear like he was caving into those demands. What would be the significance if he did move him?
Well, I think to a large degree, it depends very much on who replaces him. I mean, the point is, look, Shoigu has proven to be, I mean, he was a very able civilian, civil peacetime defense minister. He's proven to be catastrophically bad as a wartime one. Now, you've got to realize that what happens is, in war, and although this is technically a special military operation, in practice it's a war, in many ways what happens is the roles of the defense minister and the chief of the general staff reverse. In peacetime, defense minister is boss. In war, in effect, it's the chief of the general staff who kind of calls the shots, reports directly to Putin, and the defense minister's job is just to more or less ensure that the soldiers have everything that they need. Shoigu's done a sort of a middling job of that. But the point is, the key job he hasn't done is been able to bring some real realism into Putin's own discussions. So, although he would clearly, if he went, it would be very popular with the soldiers, for whom he's become deeply unpopular. And it would probably mean a new chief of the general staff, because generally a new defense minister will also bring in a new chief of the general staff. And so the interesting thing is it all depends on who these people are. Now, one of the potential candidates that's sometimes being discussed is the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov, very much a kind of close, loyal Putin crony, who's actually would probably be an even worse defense minister than Shoigu. I mean, certainly if I was sitting in Kiev, I would be rooting for Zolotov. On the other hand, another one of the possibilities is a man by the name of Alexei Dumin, who's the governor of Tula region, a former Putin bodyguard, but also a former deputy defense minister, who actually has a pretty good reputation as being an able organizer. So if it was him and a more effective soldier as chief of the general staff, suddenly the Russian military might be looking in a rather stronger position. This is why exactly it's not so much about Shoigu going. I mean, Putin has held on to him because Shoigu is a friend, a personal friend, and also, again, because Shoigu is, let's say, the continuity candidate. Putin doesn't want to see disruptive upsets at the top of his security apparatus. But if he goes, so much will depend on who replaces him. The Ukrainians have time and time again shown themselves to be very hard to predict for the Russians. And in part, that actually, look, there's a lot of really smart Russia analysts and so forth Ukraine analysts within the Russian government structure, whether we're talking about the intelligence services or the foreign ministry or whatever. The problem is that the people at the very top, Putin and those people closest to him, have this extraordinary notion of Ukraine. It's clear, we've seen this from Putin's speeches and his deeply weird historical essays, that as far as he's concerned, Ukraine is not a real country. The Ukrainians are not a real people. Part of Ukraine, frankly, is just a semi-detached part of Poland, and the rest really is part of kind of Russia's cultural space. And, once he's got that fixed in his mind, Putin clearly is not willing to listen to alternative perspectives. And this has been one of the recurring problems for the Russians, time and time again, that, it's not that they don't know what's going on. It's that Putin either cannot or will not accept the reality. So in this context, I think this is probably why it's such a challenge to try and assess accurately. I mean, it's difficult for any of us to have a real sense of whether taking Zelensky out of the picture would improve or worsen the Ukrainians' position. I think that what we're now seeing is precisely that having managed to get Ukraine so wrong so often, to a degree, the Russians are partially paralyzed by their understanding of the fact that they don't understand Ukraine. And therefore, again, I imagine that this is quite possibly one of those kind of plots which someone operationally sets up, more or less saying, look, guys, boss, if you want Zelensky dead, we think we found a way of doing it. And yet then the political leadership ums and ahs, not out of any kind of humanitarian impulse. I mean, they clearly did try to kill Zelensky at the very beginning of the war, after all. So certainly it's not humanitarian. It's that they don't really know. They are to a degree paralyzed by their continued inability to really understand what makes Ukrainians tick, let alone then how the West might respond.
It's fascinating how it's reported that this was planned as an inauguration gift for Vladimir Putin. How much does Zelensky personally get under the skin of Vladimir Putin?
He clearly does. And I think, again, it speaks to a wider issue. In some ways, the problem, as far as Putin is concerned, is that Zelensky is, a fairly, in some ways, or has been a fairly Russified Ukrainian. He grew up speaking Russian. His early career actually was in Russia. That's when he really began to make his name as a comedian and then an actor. It was on the Russian scene before he went home. Now, we know that Putin has this kind of weird way of looking at the sort of distinction between enemies and traitors. Enemies you fight with, but the point is you may sometimes be able to reach some kind of a deal with them. Traitors, though, you can do nothing with traitors except wipe them out. Whether that means, as we've seen, a defector getting shot in Spain, or, I think this is why sort of Putin has trouble with Zelensky, as far as he's concerned, Zelensky is in some ways a traitor, because he should be on the pro-Russian side of Ukrainians. He should be, as Putin sees it, willing to understand Moscow's point of view and willing to accept that Moscow has cultural, political, historical hegemony over Ukraine. And the fact that Zelensky turns round and sort of holds together this extraordinary coalition government, or coalition of the people, really, rather, in order to precisely resist Russia so effectively, I suspect, and again, look, trying to psychoanalyze Putin is in many ways a foolish and dangerous venture, but we all do it anyway. I suspect that's what really gets under Putin's skin, because as far as he's concerned, Zelensky is not an enemy, but a traitor.
We're also forecasting the potential for a new major Russian offensive effort, which is separate from the ongoing offensive effort in Donetsk, like you said, which could be possibly targeting northeast Ukraine. We've collected a variety of indicators that indicate that the Russians have been redeploying significant forces to that southwestern corner of Russia, northeastern Ukraine, in Kursk Oblast, in Bryansk Oblast, and in Belgrad Oblast. And approximately the Russians have about 50,000 forces there, according to open source Ukrainian estimates. We're very concerned about the possibility that either in late May or early June, the Russians may decide to commit to some form of an offensive effort aimed at Kharkiv Oblast, or potentially aimed at seizing Kharkiv city. We assess that the Russians will fail in any attempt to seize Kharkiv city. They simply don't have the strength and the manpower to do this. They attempted it previously back in February and March 2022, back when the Russian military was in a much stronger position, and they failed then. So they're less likely to do so now. But that's not the point. We're concerned that the Russian general staff, they have a campaign design that's deliberately intended to try to fix Ukrainian forces across the theater. And if you look at the map of the battlefield right now, the main offensive effort for the Russians clearly is Donetsk Oblast. That's where they're sending most of their forces. And if the Russians open up a new front in the northeast against Kharkiv, that will naturally force the Ukrainians to make some difficult political and military decisions about what kind of resources do they redeploy from the east to focus on defending Kharkiv. And that could, unfortunately, stretch the Ukrainians thin and potentially facilitate facilitate the likelihood of a larger Russian breakthrough in the east and Donetsk. And we think that is the thing that we're really concerned about in this potential Russian attack in the northeast.
And that issue of resources, of course, brings us on to the key question of how long it'll be until this latest batch of US military aid actually is, the impact of it has actually felt on the front line. I know you mentioned a moment ago, George, you think it will be a couple of weeks at least, but I mean, how long is a couple of weeks? Is that literally 2 weeks' time? Could it be longer than that? And when will we actually see a difference on the front line?
Yeah, the logistics question is difficult for me to answer with a high level of confidence because I don't have any access to classified logistics information. But we know that they've not appeared yet. And all of the American senior official reporting, as well as what Ukrainian officials have volunteered, indicates that it'll probably take a few more weeks. I don't know what the exact number is until the aid reaches the front lines at scale. We might start seeing equipment starting to trickle in the coming maybe fortnight or so. But really, to get the aid coming at scale is going to take a while. And so there is this window of opportunity where the Russians can try to make whatever gains that they can now.
Of course, one of the big questions with this new aid is how it's actually going to be used by Ukraine. What did you make of David Cameron, the UK Foreign Secretary's comments last week that Britain is now prepared for Ukraine to use British-supplied weapons against Russian targets in Russia?
I think that's a wonderful act of leadership by the UK government, and really it's a part of a larger trend of where the UK has been, in fact, leading the charge and supporting Ukraine and helping the rest of the West, be it Germany sometimes or be it the United States and others, to actually take the steps that are necessary for the Ukrainians to actually be victorious and defeat the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, German and particularly American policy has created a de facto sanctuary. I call it Putin's safe space. This is the airspace and the territory in the border regions of Russia, in the immediate vicinity of Ukraine, that are indeed strikeable. They are within the range of Western-provided Ukrainian weapons, but that the Ukrainians actually cannot strike because there's a moratorium on striking those territories. And what this sanctuary and safe space functions as is as a massive shield in which the Russians can place and forward deploy logistics equipment. They can fly aircraft in. They can have their rear area support, combat support and service support elements, and they use all that to optimize it's the long shaft of the spear that they use to thrust the tip into Ukraine. And the Ukrainians should interdict it, and they should degrade it, because it will reduce the Russians' ability to project force into Ukraine if they can strike that. I'd like to also talk about the airspace aspect. The Russians have been conducting intensified glide bomb attacks against Kharkiv city since the beginning of this year. By nature of geography, Kharkiv is damned to not be able to defend itself should this safe space and sanctuary continue indefinitely. The range of the Russian glide bombs is 40 to 60 kilometers. Kharkiv is 40 kilometers from the international border. That means that Russian aircraft can drop an infinite number of glide bombs and against Kharkiv city if American patriots are not able to actually interdict and strike those Russian aircraft while they're still in Russian airspace. So I really do hope that we reevaluate this policy, and the UK taking this charge on this, like how it previously has with sending Challenger tanks to force the Germans and Americans' hand, and also with the Storm Shadow missiles for long-range fires. Very necessary step, and I see it as a positive development.
I wanted to ask you about Russia's use of glide bombs to target Kharkiv, because there have been reports over recent days that Russia accidentally bombed Belgrad because a Russian jet carrying glide bombs that were going towards Kharkiv mistakenly dropped munitions on its own territory. Now, that has happened before, but what do you make of that, George?
It's not particularly surprising. I mean, like I said, the Russian Air Force has been extremely active in northeast Ukraine over the last several months. In the first quarter of this year, the Russians dropped well over 2,000 glide bombs, which is a massive volume. And when you have pilots and crews operating around the clock to conduct that many attacks, that high volume attacks. There's bound to be human error. There's bound to be mistakes. The Russians similarly accidentally bombed Belgrad back in April 2023. It'll happen again. That's just sort of par for the course when you're conducting large-scale combat operations.
So that's a price that Russia is prepared to pay.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate reality, but the point of it is that, pain comes to the Russians. The Ukrainians have struck Belgrad before. The Russians have struck Belgrad accidentally. I recall last year, pro-Ukrainian Russian volunteers even went so far as to drive American-provided Humvees into Belgrad, where they had skirmishes and a raid. And the thing that I find notable about all this activity is these are all events that actually, if you look at Russia's military doctrine and nuclear defense doctrine, these are red lines that do, in fact, actually are justified cause for Russia to use nuclear escalation. And the Russians have never, ever decided that they're going to do that, in fact, because I think that, well, Putin correctly understands that doing so would not fix his problems. It would actually generate more problems. So I'm glad that we have these little anecdotes and vignettes where we can demonstrate that the Russian border is not this magical protective veil that if you transgress it, all of a sudden it means that we are ipso facto guaranteed towards some sort of Armageddon.
That's interesting, because that would be the justification that the people who are more cautious about, for example, using Western-supplied weapons to strike Russian targets, they would say, look, what we don't want to have is an escalation that may lead to Putin using tactical nuclear weapons. But you think the threat of that is overstated, do you?
I do. And we could talk about the benefits of, we actually have a quite nuanced assessment for this. And I'll just take us through it real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
Using a tactical nuclear weapon actually doesn't solve any of the Russian problems. There's a place in doctrine, Russian military doctrine, that prescribes how and the manner in which you use a tactical nuclear weapon. And there's really two basic use cases, crudely speaking, and that is to, number one, destroy a large concentration of your adversary's forces when they present themselves on a juicy target for maximum effect. And the second one is to facilitate movement on the battlefield by punching a hole in your adversary's line and then taking your own mechanized forces and driving through the hole. In the case of the Ukrainians operate along a 600-mile-long front line. They're distributed. They actually, in fact, have manpower problems. And so the Ukrainians do not present themselves and provide those large, juicy targets that would naturally be attractive for a tactical nuclear weapon strike. In the case of maneuver warfare, that requires a highly trained force. It also requires a highly ready force. For there to be a mushroom cloud in the enemy line, there's now a gap. And then for, say, a battalion commander or a company commander to point to his men and say, all right, guys, we're suiting up into our radioactive protective suits. We're getting into the radioactive protected vehicles, and then we're driving into the mushroom cloud to go ahead and exploit that. I think the Russian military of early 2022, before the officer corps, the modern vehicles, and the professional prepared force had been eviscerated, they were prepared to do those sort of tasks. They had been trained on how to do it. They, in principle, knew how to do it. But that's not the Russian military today. It's full of volunteers and irregular forces. The elite units have all been ground out, reconstituted multiple times. The Russians are pulling vehicles from long-term storage and mothballs that I'm confident have not been all recertified to be able to safely operate in an irradiated, contaminated battlefield. And so the Russians very well might try to drop the bomb to create that hole. But the whole point of that is to facilitate maneuver, and the Russians simply can't do the maneuver phase. So this consideration, in addition to the fact that we have multiple vignettes here over the course of the last 2+ years, where the Ukrainians have indeed transgressed the explicit red lines for what constitutes the reasons for when Russia militarily can use nuclear weapons in defense of the Russian homeland, leads me to assess that while we cannot completely rule out the risk of nuclear escalation, it actually remains extremely low. And the Russians, in fact, use their nuclear saber rattling in order to self-deter the Western states from undertaking the necessary decisions that must be taken if we're serious about helping the Ukrainians defeat Russia.
Why do you think the US, for example, isn't coming to the same conclusion. Why do you think, judging by some of their reservations in terms of how Ukraine may use its weapons to hit Russian targets, why do you think they are more cautious about that?
Well, I think the officials in the United States and in Washington, they have a huge responsibility to keep us out of Armageddon, and that's no easy task. And so I think they're extremely cautious about the risks of escalation. And it's an inherently virtuous thing to try to evade that risk. However, I think what has happened is that we've collected enough objective historical evidence from the battlefield in Ukraine, and we've tested Vladimir Putin's decision-making enough over the course of the last 2.5 years that we can actually see that you actually can push back on the Russians in certain kinds of ways without risking there being escalation or retaliation.
I think so. I think Russia has got a very small window of opportunity. They have got, on the front line, from a one-dimensional perspective, they've got the initiative at the moment. They're moving forward very slowly in certain areas. That's partially because what Ukraine is doing is they're trading space for time. So they're holding the Russians up for as long as they can. But as soon as they recognize that it's hopeless and they're going to lose too much equipment and too many people, they then withdraw back a little bit more. But every time they go back, their defenses aren't quite as good. So the Russians have got the potential to move forward elsewhere. And the Russians, there's some indications to suggest that they're planning a bigger attack in through the northeast. And why are they doing this at the moment? They know that the US aid has been unlocked, that $61 billion. They know that there's more aid's been unlocked from Europe. But they also know that it's slow in coming in because the Western defense industrial bases don't quite have the capacity to feed in the huge numbers of pieces of ammunition and the equipment that is coming. So they see this as a small window of opportunity. And Putin, of course, today is his inauguration day. He wants to try and show some form of success to the people and say, look at how good I am. I'm dealing with Ukraine, but more appropriately, he'll say, I'm pushing the West back.
And how well prepared is Ukraine to resist any potential Russian offensive, given the full effect of the US aid hasn't been felt yet?
Ukraine's as prepared as it can be with a lack of ammunition, and in particular artillery ammunition and rocket ammunition. It needs. It's more vulnerable, as we've seen, to attacks from the air. It's more vulnerable on the front line because it doesn't have the indirect fire capability with the HIMARS rockets and with artillery ammunition to deal with the groupings of Russian forces as they prepare to come in. But it's still killing between 900 and 1,000 Russian soldiers a day. 20 to 40 pieces of Russian equipment today. 10 to 20 tanks a day are being destroyed. That's significant. Russia is using meat grinder tactics to just punch up against the Ukrainians. And almost whenever you're getting into that point where they don't care about the casualties, no matter how much ammunition you've got, they're just going to push through at some stage. Ukraine hasn't quite got the engineering assets to be able to deliver different layers of defensive positions to fall back on slowly whilst they're waiting for this ammunition and the rest of the military material to come forward.
You mentioned, Philip, Russia's meat grinder tactics, and obviously you need fresh troops to feed into the meat grinder, as it were. Are you expecting to hear more potentially from Putin after his inauguration today about a fresh wave of Russian mobilization?
Yeah, I think he'll do everything he can to try and mobilize by stealth. So he'll find different ways of finding more people to come through. But as it gets worse, and it will get worse for him, he's going to have to come into more public mobilization. And we're beginning to see the rhetoric behind that. It's been building up for quite some time. Describing this conflict as not being a conflict against Ukraine. It's a conflict against the West. He's trying to defeat NATO. It's NATO that's attacking Russia. Russia is under threat. And even with this speech that he gave today at the end of his inauguration, he was talking about Russia's collective response and collective responsibility to deal with the threat. So he's building it up in people's minds that this is bigger than the issue that he started, and he's blaming everyone else for it.
I want to get your thoughts, Philip, on something we discussed on yesterday's episode of Frontline. I was joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, and he was saying that he thinks it is feasible for Ukraine to launch a new counteroffensive against Russia in 2024, and he said there would be significant advantages to having one sooner rather than later, to launch one potentially in the autumn of 2024 as opposed to in 2025. Do you agree?
I do and I don't. I think Ukraine needs to make sure that they are ready to launch the counteroffensive. And what's made the counteroffensive that they launched last year not work? They didn't own the air. So, they couldn't create areas of air superiority for the ground forces then to fight through in. They didn't have the engineering assets to deal with the massively complex defenses that Russia had built around the Suvorikhin lines that are there. They didn't have the ammunition stocks and the numbers of troops ready to properly exploit that. So what have the Ukrainians done? They've effectively allowed the front line to freeze, and they're hollowing the Russians out from behind with what I've described before in this program as SOE-type tactics. General Bodanov, the head of the GUR or HUR, as they're called as well, the head of the military intelligence, is carrying out attacks on Russian oil refineries on logistic basis and command and control. He's been behind the sinking of almost 50% of the Black Sea Fleet. Air defense sites are being attacked. Russian airfields are being attacked, and everything else. That's hollowing them out. So when the Ukrainians are ready to punch through, hopefully those defenses are going to be an awful lot weaker, because what's behind them, there's little substance. But he needs to get the Western aircraft in. The pilots need to have the ammunition. They need to have the experience in the aircraft to be able to provide that local air defense or air superiority bubble around any ground defensive that's in. And then there needs to be the all-armed fight. And we haven't seen the Ukrainians use their armored forces in a mass way yet. That's how we'd see them used from a Western perspective. We see a brigade or a division level attack. We're seeing the Ukrainians using the tanks in ones or twos, and we're seeing the casualties coming through in ones or twos. That's the old Soviet style tactics that the Russians are using. And there's a lot more to go. So they could potentially go this year. The autumn's not the best time because the ground gets too soft for Western tanks and Western armored vehicles. But I think it's probably more likely and possibly better for them if they can continue this hollowing out late spring, early summer 2025.
You mentioned, Philip, Vladimir Putin and his increasing rhetoric of a war not just with Ukraine, but against the West. And I wonder if that feeds into the fact that we've now got European intelligence agencies warning that Russia is planning, and I quote, violent acts of sabotage across Europe as part of a more aggressive and concerted effort against the West. What form do you think those attacks would take?
No, that's the $6 million question. Russia has attacked the West. It's attacked the UK. It's attacked the UK with weapons of mass effect. You look at the poisoning of Litvinchenko with polonium-210. If you look at the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, his daughter Yulia, in Salisbury with Novichok, its first use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK or the streets of Europe, or the first one that we'd discovered at that stage. Looking back, it seems the Russians have been using it beforehand, and we're getting stories coming through of companies that are linked to Ukraine, their warehouses and other things mysteriously catching fire in London. Now, the Russians have got the ability through their organizations associated with their military intelligence, the GRU, to put saboteurs in different places. Whether those saboteurs are going to carry out more Novichok-type poisonings, or whether mysterious fires are going to come out, or whether it's going to be something more serious, we see a growth in terrorism. That's a possibility. A greater possibility and probability is what we're going to see is Russia trying to stimulate other groupings that are operating across Europe and in the UK to carry out more violent acts. So, potentially ISIS or Al-Qaeda, Islamist-related terror organizations suddenly find that they're getting training and help and sponsorship and access to weapons and explosives from a source that they don't know. That source would likely be Wagner, which is linked to the GRU. And of course, they're operating throughout Africa, so we've got the links into the command and control that there is in these terror organizations. And we are already saying what Russia's doing in the information domain. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the information domain to create protests, to create disruption and all the rest of it across the country. We're seeing the protests in support of the Palestinians causing disruptions in many countries across the world and causing real political dilemmas. Russia will be behind a lot of that. That's something that people don't realize. They'll be funding a lot of what's going on and helping to stimulate it because they can see a fracture, they can see political influence, and they'll put the proverbial knife in and wiggle it to see how far it goes. So I think we're already being attacked.
What do you make of the fear of escalation that has been kind of warned against by so many leaders in this situation?
I mean, you're presumably talking about nuclear exchanges or use of nuclear weapons or even an attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station in that regard. And I think the issue there will be whether the Chinese, in fact, are restraining the Russians on all that. And I think they are. That's certainly what our understanding is. And that's somewhat reassuring. But, one of the problems in Russia is that the leadership lives in an increasingly small, isolated bubble. It's very clear throughout this war in Ukraine and the predecessing period that accurate information and policy advice was not passed up to the leadership. And that's a big problem in an autocratic system. And it means that it becomes somewhat unpredictable as to which path the country takes. And I think one of the things that's really been saving grace, if you like, is the fact that Russia's intent has never really been matched by its capabilities, either economic or military or political. And that's basically what saved us. I mean, China, in a way, is the opposite, has huge capabilities, but not as malign an intent. So I think that's how we have to look at Russia, and we have to realize that it's being run by a very small clique of people who are selected as a result of their loyalty to Putin rather than their competence, and that the transmission of information upwards and downwards is very difficult, and that's a problem.
And in response to those comments by the British Foreign Secretary, Russia has come back saying it could hit back at British military installations and equipment in Ukraine and elsewhere, and threatening in its southern military district to carry out exercises. How could the war in Ukraine escalate, not by design, but by accident?
Yeah, well, I've talked again about this before, that the war in Ukraine looks more to me like the First World War than the Second World War in that sense. And we all know that, events can sort of take on or accidental or small events like the Sarajevo assassination in that case, can kind of escalate very quickly and get out of control. And I think that's the risk here. It would be that effectively someone would make a mistake or miscalculate in an attack, and a missile would land on Poland, or a Romanian plane would be shot down or something like this, which could lead to exchanges at a higher level. I hope that doesn't happen. I think the Russians are being utterly reckless at the moment. Their jamming operations in the Baltic, for example, are very dangerous and could result in precisely this fear being realised.
With elections in the US, in the UK, and in many other countries this year, do you see any signs of Russia already meddling, trying to shape their outcomes?
Yes, I think the early signs are there, and I think that it will look different and feel different from what it was in 2020 and certainly in 2016. I think Russia's sort of got more savvy about this, and they will be using, for example, third country nationals in many cases to achieve their sort of objectives. I also think that things like the way in which the oil price is manipulated. Clearly, inflation is a big issue, particularly in America, as an election issue, effectively, between Biden and Trump. And if the Russians are able, through their sort of close relationships with the Saudis and the Iranians, the Venezuelans, to push the price of oil up over the summer, for example, and put a spurt of inflation into the American economy just before the election, that will play very badly for Biden. I suspect that that's the kind of thing we need to be looking out for.
What do you think President Putin would like to see in terms of the next US president?
I think he wants to see America weakened and isolationist fundamentally, and anyone, both in Congress and in the presidential campaign, that falls into that category would be welcome and worthy of support. Clearly, I think he would have a massive preference for Trump over Biden. But I think it's slightly more complicated than that because, of course, quite a lot of this decision making in America that we've seen, and particularly with the aid package passage, for example, in Congress, doesn't actually depend on the president necessarily. It depends on other parts of the governmental structure. And so they'll be looking across the board at that. And they'll also be looking at who might get some of the key jobs, defense secretary, treasury secretary, whatever, secretary of state, obviously, CIA chief, and looking at that, how that's going to play out under either scenario.
He's just started his 5th term as president. What kind of future do you foresee for him?
I don't know about him. There are lots of rumours and information about his health and so on. There's a good degree of instability in the leadership just underneath him, where people are jockeying for the succession. One of the key Russian leaders, Igor Sechin, his son, died a couple of months ago in Moscow in very mysterious circumstances. Plus, you have a lot of the instability around the economy, with people falling out of windows and people having heart attacks in their 50s and all the rest of it. So there's a good deal of instability just under the top leadership circuit. And I think the trend of Russia is to become a vassal state of China, effectively, both economically and politically, which is deeply unpopular amongst the Russian people for whatever reason. And military dependency on the likes of North Korea and Iran. I mean, this is not where your average Russian, even not particularly well-educated Russian, wants the country to be. Most Russians still want the country to be a European power and to have significant relationships with Europe, both economic and social, cultural.
You were based in Moscow at one of the more optimistic times for relations between Russia and the West. What hope can you offer for the future now?
Not much in the short term, I'm afraid. I mean, I think that if you look at Russian history, often where there's been a war that Russia's been involved in, and it's either lost or is perceived to have lost, then you get reform and regime change. And I think that has to be the hope, that eventually this war, there's a trigger point amongst the Russian people, and the regime changes, as it did after 1905 and it did in the 1850s after the defeat in the Crimean War. That's the sort of circle of Russian history, if you like. It's not a linear history like ours. It's much more of a circular history. So I think the hope is that Russia kind of burns itself out on the battleground in Ukraine, and that we see some kind of regime change leading to reform. But I'm certainly not saying that's inevitable or indeed probable, but it is possible.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.